before we had cell phones. Remember that, when everyone had landlines in their homes, way back when? And one thing when it's great that you're a member of an association, you're part of a network. So when you go to Utah and you want to see rock art, you give Al a call. 9 times out of 10, he beats you to the site, and it's the most wonderful day you'll have in your life. And you never know when the phone rings what's on the other end. So on a Sunday afternoon, right when I was watching Arizona Cardinal football game, the darn phone rings, and I pick it up. It's the Powell Museum, and they go, "Paul, I think we got something here you need to see." So I said, "The Cardinals are going to win, you know. I'm down at the museum, you know." And what unfolded from that one phone call, you'll see in this presentation, but it's a really remarkable thing. So I live in Page, Arizona, and it's hard I get antsy at these conferences, staying inside when I'm used to getting out there. So much fun, so many places to go. I live in Page, Arizona, right near Lake Powell, Colorado River, Glen Canyon Recreation Area. It's just a maze of canyons out there. And every so often, you find these historic sites. So here's a little pamphlet that I came across. It says, "Please do not remove." And I think this was, I don't know if you planted that out there or whatnot, but there's these little treasures that you find, and it's like, oh, you know, there's been other footsteps in these areas. And I'm going to be talking about Dominguez Escalante and an inscription that was located in Glen Canyon.
What year was that, Paul?
2006. And this is a pretty storied expedition. I've got some books here that are part of my library, and there's 5, 6 of them, 7 of them. So it's one of the more famous expeditions. I can say no to a lot of purchases, but when you can buy a book for $15 and someone has spent half their life writing it, I'm a sucker for that kind of thing. So it really is one of the more storied expeditions of the, you know, explorations in the Western U.S. And Escalante's Dream is a relatively new book. David Roberts, he wrote that book while he was suffering from cancer. Him and his wife did one last road trip to retrace the Dominguez Escalante route. And he passed away just a few months ago. So that's a new book to add to your collection. There's 2 maps in the back if you want to see maps from that expedition from the era on the left there, and then there's a map of all the campsites on the smaller one. So you can go out today and retrace where this party went. Okay, Dominguez Escalante, they were trying to, a couple of objectives. One, they wanted to move up into Utah and Colorado, make some better connections with the native people in those areas, see where there could be opportunities for mission sites. Another thing was maybe we'll make it over to Monterey, but probably not really, wink, wink. And so they didn't go, but it really is an expedition of very high significance. And 1,700 miles is what they completed over almost 160 days. And it was really the first comprehensive effort to explore that area and document it with maps. And a very good diary was kept. And so it's a great read. You know, you get day by day, multi-page descriptions sometimes of their journey. So 10 men left Santa Fe on July 29, 1776. And then 13 men came back on January 2nd. So these were the 8 men that went with Dominguez and Escalante. They picked up a few guides along the way, so they ended up with 13 when the party came back. Here's a route of their expedition, leaving Santa Fe, traveling past Durango, around Grand Mesa in Colorado, up toward Jensen. They visited some native peoples and villages here by the Utah Lake, and then they started heading south a bit. Like Al was telling us, they knew what their latitude was, so they knew, hey, at this point, we're a little too far north, let's drift south. But just like this last month where we had that real early snowstorm, I think Cedar City had like, how many, 8 inches? It was a good dump, right? 20 inches. So you were living in Dominguez Escalante. They had, I think on October 6th, they had a kind of one of those early snowstorms, and it kind of changed their demeanor about, can we really make it over to California or not? But what I want to point out is once they decided we're not going to go to California, they had to get back to Santa Fe. So they went toward the Grand Canyon, and then they had heard about a crossing of the Colorado River, and they ended up coming right through Page. That became known as the Crossing of the Fathers on the way back. And also on this map highlighted is Armijo's route in the smaller dashed line. So leaving Aqui up towards Four Corners. They used the very same crossing, I think by design. They knew they could get across the Colorado River there and then on to Kanab towards St. George and on. But what I want to point out is you hear sometimes that Armijo retraced Dominguez Escalante. Really didn't. They picked the same crossing, but if you look, it's 100 miles or more different. You know, there's only one little piece around Page that's the same, and then here they're cutting across it, and Al made that kind of comment earlier today. So it's a misnomer to say they followed the same route.
Did they have a guide?
Right here by the Creso Mountains, they traded some horses for a Navajo guide because they knew they wanted to get to the Crossing of the Fathers, but they didn't know how to get there. And I'm going to show you a picture. So here's an old map that shows that Crossing of the Fathers. You had Canyonlands up this way and Grand Canyon down below. This was one of the very few places where there was a big bend in the river that you could get across the river. But it takes 3 things to have a river crossing. You've got to have a place where you can get across the water, but then what else do you need? You've got to have a way to get down to the water, and then you have to have a way to get out. So all 3 ingredients have to come together, and I'll show you some pictures of the challenge of that. In the interest of time, I'm going to speed through a couple of these, but there's more detail that you can find about the history of Grand Canyon and the different routes that we're taking. And then I want to point this emblem out here, that there was the bicentennial of the expedition. Nelson, hold those up. So at the 200th anniversary of the expedition, there was a group that got Grant, and they retraced the route, and they came up with an interpretation plan. So this emblem here represents a D and an E. And if you travel around the West from time to time, you'll see monuments and references to that emblem. So there's 2 books you can get, one retracing the route and identifying campsites, and another one with the interpretation plan. Okay, anybody see the Crossing of the Fathers out there? So this is the view from the Navajo Nation looking from south to north, and you can just see what a maze of canyons it is. And right out here somewhere hidden is the Colorado River and the way to get down. So they had a guide that they picked up by the Creso Mountains that took them close to Navajo Mountain, which is just off the screen here. But then the guide left. And so when you read their diary, they really slowed down. They had to unpack their mules to get down these canyons. It took them a while to get to the crossing, and there was only one path that you could navigate to get through there. So quite the challenge. So they had very limited guide services out. I think you asked that question. So it's what I'm going to tell you now is about what happened with our chapter that we formed in Page. And a 1 in a million needle in a haystack type of find. So here's a preview of this inscription. It says Paso por Aqui, Año 1776, and it's fairly large. This has for scale. It had some graffiti on it, which ended up being a way that we could authenticate and date this inscription.
You ever find out who Rob and Katie are?
All we know is they're divorced. Bad karma. So that turnaround point for Dominguez Escalante shortly after that snowstorm was a date that Al mentioned today. The date where they put up all those signs on one day. Anybody remember? October 11th, right there. And that's when they let God decide by casting a lot if they were going to go to Monterey or back to Santa Fe. So that was a dramatic point of that expedition. But now I'm going to tell you the story of the most dramatic part of that whole expedition. So this was you know how you have that commercial break, you know, and you run and grab something and then you go back to the series, the next episode. So stay tuned here, don't tune out quite yet. Okay, I'm going to focus in on this period of their diary, October 26th to November 7th. And I put this word right here just for Al, because he says they weren't lost. I'm going to tell you, they might have known where they were, but not really. They were lost. And also hungry and cold. All right, so they ended up, because they did not have a guide, and the guides that they had in southern Utah, they had communication issues, more southern Paiute versus Ute, so it was more hand signals, and the guides were very nervous about even helping this expedition. So all they knew was there was a way you could get across the river, and the water was way steep. And they ended up going too far south because they really wanted to go visit the Havasupai Indians on the other side of the Grand Canyon. And they gave up on that idea, but then they ended up trapped down by Lee's Ferry, which is kind of a box canyon in that area. So their first attempt was to send 2 people in November to swim across this cold river, and they put their clothing on top of their heads, tried to swim across. They nearly drowned, they got across, but they lost their clothes, and they realized this isn't going to work for us. So that failed. They sent a scout out to see how they could get out this box canyon. Spent a good part of a day going up the Priya River. Came back and said, we're blankety blank, you know, we'll try. So they said, okay, well, let's try building a raft. So there's driftwood in there. They built together a little raft with some poles and tried to pole across the river. Well, Lee's Ferry is pretty deep there, and so they didn't go very far at all, and then they just a whirlpool took them back. But thank goodness, because you know what's right below Lee's Ferry? It's the Grand Canyon, 275 miles. So God was with them, I think, to push them back in that whirlpool. So they did a timeout again. They sent 2 scouts out, 2 brothers. They were gone for 2 days, I believe. And they said, you know, the only way to get out is 1,700 feet of these cliffs if you want to go further upstream. And this is known now as the Dominguez Pass. I took this picture, I've hiked it a couple times. There's not much of a trail there, and it's pretty steep on top, but I walked one time from Lee's Ferry, up this Dominguez Pass, across the flats, all the way back to Page, right to my house. And I did it the same day that Dominguez Escalante, because I wanted to prove that, number one, I could do it, and that you could travel that distance. You know, we have debates on how far could these people travel in one day. So I did it on foot. Okay, so once they get to like the Waweep area where Lake Powell is, on the Waweep Creek, they go across to the kind of east-southeast where they can see Navajo Canyon. And there was a way they could get down. It was pretty steep, but you could get down and you could get across, but they didn't know how to get out. So they sent one guy and then a second guy and said, hey, go out that canyon, send us a smoke signal if you can find a way out. And the party stayed there another day, and they never saw the smoke, so then they moved upstream. And what they were looking for was known as the historic crossing that the Ute Indians used. So here's that big bend of the Colorado River, and this is the site they were looking for. But it was further upstream. Here's a picture of that slower water down at river level before Lake Powell came into the picture. And like I mentioned before, 53 years later, Antonio Amigo and his mule caravan, this is the river crossing that they chose in advance to get to. And so you can read in the Old Spanish Trail, Nathan and Nathan book, the diary, and they talk about following in the footsteps of the Padres missionaries at this part of their trip. So pretty historic crossing, used for thousands of years. And this is what I mentioned about their Miho diary, December 8th. We stopped the train and repaired the upgrade of the canyon, the same one which had been worked by the Padres. And here's a picture of the steps that were relocated back in 1937. That's underwater now. People have asked with Lake Powell and the drought dropping these steps out. And no, these were right just a little bit above the river, but they're still 200 feet underwater, and they won't be ever really exposed. Well, even in dead pool, where they can't release any more water, these will still be covered up. See Gregory Crampton, he was part of OSTA and wrote In Search of Old Spanish Trail. He did the historical review for Glen Canyon before Lake Powell filled it up. And so here's his map of the crossing of the Fathers, where these inscriptions were found right here. And I've never heard anyone really explain those kind of inscriptions. So Al, I don't know if you've seen those, but if anyone can interpret that and shed some light on those, very, very unusual and different. And those could have been the inscriptions that Amigo talked about finding. Here's Gunsight Butte and Gunsight Pass. Here's a picture of getting down to that Ute crossing with a mule train in the Gregory expedition, 1913. And this is the pass that went to the Ute crossing. It was named Gunsight Pass by the Utah Territorial Militia in 1869. And the reason it was called Gunsight, do you see that notch? Do you see the butte, a cookie jar butte right through there? And so one of the lessons learned was until the Amigo chapter went out to this site where the inscription was and stood at this exact location on this one hill, that's the only place you can see that Gunsight butte. And no one really in our local area knew the story of the naming of Gunsight Butte and Gunsight Pass. So that was kind of a revelation and a fun part of this inscription. Okay, I'm just going to touch briefly on here to let you know that where Dominguez Escalante couldn't get across the river at Lee's Ferry, eventually a ferry was put in by John D. Lee, and so once that became operational, I think in 1871, might be a couple of years off on that. Jacob Hamlin had been over to Hopi as early as 1860, but mainly he used the crossing of the Fathers to get across. So the very first time a raft was built to get across was in 1868, and that was a year before John Wesley Powell came down. But once that ferry went in, then there was no reason to use that footpath to the U crossing. This area here became the main crossing from, basically that first raft in 1869 all the way to 1929 when the Navajo Bridge was constructed. And then from there, we had Glade Canyon Bridge, highways came in, the world got modern, and that U crossing sat neglected. The crossing that had been used for thousands and thousands of years, and used by Dominguez Escalante, used by Armijo, used by John Wesley Powell, his second expedition. He actually left the river at the crossing of the Fathers, went to Kanab and Salt Lake City to see Emma, his wife. All those footsteps that happened all over that whole period of time were neglected, and no one went back into that area. Until Lake Powell happened. 1963, the dam was finished. They started to flood this area. The water was backing up. So here's that big bend, the crossing of the Fathers. This is Padre Butte, Dominguez Butte. This is the Navajo Nation. So that trail came along here, went down, and this was that river crossing. And see this road that's carved in here? That was the river takeout. And the very first boats that launched at Lake Powell used that way to get to the crossing of the Fathers. Okay, so way back when I had a landline in my house, the hat I wore with the Old Spanish Trail was Arizona Director. And I felt really embarrassed about that because, for one, Arizona doesn't have very much of the trail in our state, so we're like a stepchild almost. But Rio, very first one was there, so we were always proud of that. But we didn't have a chapter in Arizona. So I said, well, we got to get that changed. And I had given a number of community lectures about the Old Spanish Trail. There seemed to be a little bit of an interest, so we said, okay, we had a special meeting. You need 10 people to start a chapter. So we talked about it on a Saturday afternoon. We had about a dozen people there. Jeff, I don't know if you were at that meeting or not, but we decided, yeah, we have enough to make a chapter. And then it's like, okay, who wants to be president? And we had to lock the doors before we raised that question. But a gentleman named Jim Page was pretty confident. He says, I'll be president. And then the next question is, well, where's the trail? And so because there's no signs up or anything else, but we talked about the crossing of the Fathers, Padre Bay, and then Jim said, well, Monday, I'm going out with these group of volunteers to remove graffiti as a volunteer group with the Park Service, and he was the boat captain, and he says, we're going to Padre Bay. We're going to find that Old Spanish Trail. So that's a great volunteer effort. The houseboat's named True Grit, and it's graffiti removal intervention team. So what they do is they go out where people just now carve, like Robin Cathy type things. They'll go survey an area, and then what doesn't take much but a wire brush and water, you can remove that graffiti. So they went out that week to Padre Bay, and I think on the third day as they were scouting, this young woman here said, hey, what's this, Jim? And Jim comes over and they see this really faint inscription. And Jim had been to El Morro in New Mexico and seen the inscriptions there. several times. So he recognized immediately Paso, Aqui, that could be something. So here's that same picture that we saw. Here's a close-up. It's pretty faint. It had a definite style to it. Here's the Aqui, a big sweeping A. So it had a different style to it. Here's 1776. The one was different. It had the serifs. These sevens have a little ball. The 6 was kind of offset and not closed. So it really, here's a close-up of that. It had just some detail to it that was made it stand out. So we were pretty excited. One of the lessons learned was, when I went to the museum, one of the volunteers was showing me pictures of this inscription. And it's like, wow. And I hadn't even heard from Jim yet. He was still unpacking the boat as captain. And so within 3 days, I took off work, I took my boat. I had some sketchy details from Jim on where this was. And I went out there and looked at it, and it was like, wow, this is great. We had called the Park Service to come down to the museum, and we waited and waited. The archaeologist there, we waited. We finally called back again. She goes, oh, I'm busy doing laundry. And so one of the lessons learned was it took 6 months for the Park Service to go visit this site. And they didn't have knowledge of it. It wasn't in their files. And they were, they're more, depending on who the persons are, they're more dialed into archaeology than history. So the chapters are very important to push to make the history become more relevant. So we came up with a game plan, site assessment. We did a laser scan. We brought in other regional archaeologists, different historians, including Joe Sanchez, Bud Ruscio, who's passed away. People that were experts on lichen and varnish to help us date the inscription. Richard, is there anyone right in the hall? Do you want to tell them to come back in?
Starting.
I told Dylan he was finished, but he has like 5 minutes still. Are you guys good? Okay, thanks.
Okay, well, I've got 5 more minutes. So I just want to say here that for the chapter, or any chapter, it's important to work with the federal land managers. There's many things to do, getting permits, site assessment, documenting it, getting things on the National Register of Historic Places is important, and helping to come up with a management plan. So we thought it was authentic, but we had to prove to ourselves that it wasn't a hoax. And the diary mentioned an inscription on the Green River that was carved by Lane on a poplar or cottonwood tree. So it was curious why, if this inscription was authentic, why that wasn't referenced in the diary. So that was something we had to go through. And then you always have to check to see if something's been forged. So we had to prove the date of that inscription somehow. So we brought in a laser scan at night to get a 3D profile of the inscription. That was an exciting, it was like a Raiders of the Lost Ark type of event to get all this equipment in there. And I'm going to show you the result of their laser scan in a little movie here. And it's going to clean up all that graffiti and show you what that inscription looks like. So here's the inscription as it looked with the graffiti. And now they're going to do their processing with the data that they collected with the laser scan. So they're going through a process now to show the reflectivity, how that's different than the inscription. Now they're going to fly like a canyon, the inscription, so you can see what kind of tool might have been used, get a lot of detail. Now they're going to wipe away the graffiti. But you can see how the inscription is much different than the more modern graffiti. And it revealed more detail about Anu. And so this is kind of cleaned up. We were hoping to find a faint signature like you see at El Morro, but we never did. So that's what the inscription looks like with the graffiti removed. And the Miho chapter paid for this. So with the power of influence, $10 in our pocket, twisting some arms and elbows. We got people excited about it. They're like, Al, when you go out with Al, you get so darn excited, you open your wallet up. Okay, so the last thing I'll talk about here is the smoking gun. So the Park Service still wasn't bought in that this was authentic, but the Miho chapter kept pushing through, and we brought in a professor from ASU and voted him out there. He took some varnish samples with a special like needle syringe to get samples of the rock varnish, the patina that goes on these inscriptions. And it's like tree rings. So what you can find is there's dark and orange bands depending on the climate, the weather conditions when the varnish was formed. So this was the host rock. Anyway, they have this like tree rings stated across the region, these sequences that go back in time, back to 11,000 years on these rock surfaces. And it's related to climate swings back and forth. So we tested the host rock and we saw 2 of these banded areas. Okay, so that kind of said that host rock had been there a long time with its varnish. And then we tested the graffiti, and it was all orange. So that was relatively new. So this was let me just clarify this picture here. So this was the inscription itself. It had one dark band, okay? So it was completely different than the modern graffiti. And 1776, if anyone was awake in 3rd grade American history, they're all familiar with what was happening way back on the East Coast. That same November, December time period. And look at the Delaware River, frozen. So this was part of the Little Ice Age. You can do your own research about that climatic period, but very significant, not only in North America, but in Europe too. And then the very last thing we did with the samples is we looked for lead contamination. So the varnish was 20 millimeters deep, and this was the percent lead. And so the first 15 microns were lead-free. And then the last 100 years with the Industrial Revolution and automobiles and burning of fuel, the lead got deposited in the varnish. And then we checked our inscription. Paso Aqui didn't have as much varnish, but the first 10 microns were lead-free, and then you saw the lead. And then the graffiti was all high lead. So this indicated that the inscription was more than 100 years old, and it was created during the Little Ice Age. So I'll kind of end my talk here. There's more to the story of what we learned, but the location of this site was a little bit north of where people thought Dominguez Escalante went in their diary. Because of bad weather, they huddled for a long time and did the Litany of the Virgin. And so in these books that you read, they're saying they just stopped on the trail and tried to get out of the rain. But right near where that inscription panel was, where they did a prayer ceremony, look at that, there's an alcove. So it tied together that that's where you would stop to weather the storm and do the Litany of the Virgin. And then write the inscription. I wrote a paper that's in that symposium that and now it's on the National Register of Historic Places. The Park Service has put a cage up to protect the site. There's an interpretive sign there, and the volunteers are recognized. Here's what the site looks like today. And I was there. One of the lessons learned is go to these sites during the same month, same time of day. So this is within 2 days of when they did the inscription in November, the same time of day. And you can imagine after doing that Litany of the Virgin and the sky broke from the pelting hailstorm and snow and rain. Look at that sunbeam coming in. So if you were going to write an inscription and thank the Lord, pretty powerful. Oh, that's another piece of authentication, I think. That concludes my talk. Thank you very much.
You didn't say anything about the calligraphy, the calligraphy association of the letters.
Yeah, I kind of skipped over that a little bit, but that's another thing we looked at was the flare. People still had debate about that because some of it didn't match Alvaro, but some of it did. So there was a little bit of controversy. But the smoking gun was the lead and the varnish. Then that was the